From the International Labour Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, this is the Future of Work podcast. I'm Anders Johnson, here to talk today about universal basic income. How would you react to being given money every month to spend in any way you want, with no strings attached? Would you save it, spend it, invest it, and if so, on what? Would you use it to make your life better, or that of your family or community? That's the basic idea behind universal basic income, where a government or institution gives citizens a set amount of money on a regular basis, in the hope of alleviating poverty or replacing other social programs that potentially require more bureaucratic involvement. In a world with continued or even rising unemployment and inequality, with fears of automation and artificial intelligence replacing workers, or where pandemics or other catastrophes limit people's ability to work, this direct payment to citizens is being increasingly mentioned as a possible solution. So far, so good. But what are the unintended consequences of such cash transfers? What happens when good intentions meet the real world? To discuss this, I'm excited to have with us Lauren DeFilippo, co-director of the documentary Free Money, which chronicles 5 years in the lives of residents in the village of Kogutu in Kenya, where an experiment is being carried out that involves handing out money for free as part of the world's largest universal basic income project. It's a fascinating and very real story filled with the unexpected, and I can't wait to talk about it. So, Lauren, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
First things first, as you see it, what is universal basic income all about?
So universal basic income, as you described, is really a payment that can be relied upon, whether it's monthly, bi-monthly, on a certain schedule period, so people can feel as though it's guaranteed and they can expect and plan on having that money. And it is an amount of cash with no strings attached. So there are no conditions to what people have to do with the money. They can spend it on whatever they would like. There's no means testing. It really is sort of cash that is just going out to people on a regular basis with the intention of covering their basic needs.
Now, Lauren, you're a documentary filmmaker based in New York. So what drew you to this issue and inspired you to tell this story?
Sure. So I first heard about this project, this big experiment in UBI that this organization called Give Directly was running in Africa, primarily in Kenya and in Uganda, from a New York Times article. In the New York Times Magazine, a writer named Annie Lowry profiled the first village that was receiving this money. They had done it as a lump sum. And so it was kind of just everyone in this village was receiving $1,000, and Give Directly was going to see what people did with it and report back. And through that article, I learned that Give Directly was working on a much bigger project, a follow-up that would last 12 years and would be kind of the largest and longest experiment in UBI to date. And so, I was able to gain access to the experiment and to Give Directly, and began filming in one of the villages that was a part of the 12-year experiment. That being said, it was just a really interesting moment in time. It was around, I would say like 2016 when this all began. And it was before people, at least in the US, were really talking about UBI. Basic income became a bigger part of the conversation with Andrew Yang's run for president here. And then also, during COVID with the stimulus packages and just the cash that was given by the federal government. And so it was sort of this much more niche conversation that was just really bubbling specifically among people in Silicon Valley. And so I was very interested in kind of why the people who were, potentially designing the AI that was going to put us all out of work were also so interested in UBI as a potential solution.
Your co-director is Sam Soko, a Kenyan filmmaker. Can you tell me a little bit about how he got involved in the film?
So with my partner at Insignia Films, it's based here in New York, we were able to get access to Give Directly, as I said. And so I went and I started filming in the village as Give Directly arrived, and they, rolled out the experiment and were enrolling people to be involved. And I quickly realized that as a white American, I was out of my depths in a rural Kenyan village. And I really wanted to tell the story from both sides. I wanted to tell it from the people who were doing the experimenting at Give Directly and their perspective. And I wanted to tell it from the recipient side in really an authentic way. And so I realized that in order to do that, I needed a Kenyan collaborator. And I had heard about Sam Soko just through our kind of shared doc community. He had made a wonderful film called Softy about a Kenyan journalist that I really admired. And so I reached out and we had a number of conversations. Soko was skeptical about the whole thing from the start, giving people money. How is that going to work? This NGO coming in. And so, after much conversation and Soko going to visit the village himself, he decided to sign on, and we continued making the film together for, it took us a total of 5 years.
One of the things that struck me, personally, was this idea of Westerners, once again experimenting on Kenyans, especially poor and vulnerable ones. I know that this is something that you as well sort of felt this reaction to it. So can you tell me a little bit more about it?
Yeah. So, this was something that I kind of went into the project also curious and with my own skepticism about. And it was really through conversation with Soko that I gained that kind of Kenyan and African context for it all. And, one of the things I'll never forget is Soko saying to me, in the US, you have an opioid epidemic, right? In here in Kenya and Africa, we have an NGO epidemic. We have this problem where organizations come in, they make promises, they really play on people's hopes and kind of fantasies for themselves. And in the end, there's really no accountability for these organizations. And there's no place where if a recipient does have a problem, they can go for help. And it's just so ingrained into the political system in Kenya. And so that was just really fascinating for me as an outsider coming into all of this, and something that really became a bigger part of the film as we continue to follow recipients' lives and how an organization like Give Directly engages with them.
Now, cash transfers have a very strong track record around the world in reducing poverty. So what's the difference between what I would maybe say more traditional cash transfer methods and UBI in this situation?
Well, it's interesting that you say they have a good track record, because they do. And I feel like anybody who spends any time kind of with the studies or with the research, it becomes quite clear that cash transfers are a pretty successful intervention overall. That being said, I think that there's just still this real cultural stigma to giving people cash. And so we kind of continue to do these studies and these experiments over and over again to prove to the skeptics that this is a good idea. And I think, that's kind of we're hitting the threshold of that, or I would like to think, where the evidence is there. And I do think that Give Directly's experiment will go on to provide more data in that space that hopefully will help change hearts and minds. But I think it just still is something that the public at large has a hard time really understanding. And so just this being such a massive experiment in an intervention like this, hopefully it will make a dent.
Yeah, the flip side of that seems also to be kind of true, So one of the things that surprised me when I first saw the documentary is how many people were actually reluctant to accept free money. Is this something that you were expecting?
At first I was a little shocked, but I think when you kind of put it in perspective, it's basically someone knocking on your door and saying, I'm going to give you free money every month for the next 12 years. It's going to double your average income. I mean, you would be skeptical too. It would be hard to imagine that. And I think that's precisely what was happening here. People just couldn't believe that there wasn't something that would be asked for in exchange. And so I think the skepticism was a healthy one. And it was just something that we definitely wanted to highlight in the film, that people just kind of weren't coming at this with open arms saying, yes, let's go for it. They definitely had their good questions as well.
We hadn't actually sort of mentioned this before, but can you put the actual number into perspective? I mean, what does $22 a month represent in the village of Kogutu?
So it's quite a big sum of money. It really is about double what they make on average a month. So it's significant for them. And it also is even more significant in that it's going to every member of the family who's over 18. So, this is a very kind of traditional patriarchal society. And so this was the first time kind of a lot of women were receiving their own income that was separate from their husbands. Everyone gets their own cell phone, and these come as mobile payments on their phones. And so it, potentially provides kind of independence, I think, to women like never before, and also like younger adults in a way. In a place like Kogutu, it kind of provided this new sense of autonomy that I don't think has really been seen before.
Yeah, it's a good thing you brought that up, because this reminds me of, there's these scenes, particularly early on, where the men in the village are expressing their fears that their wives might leave them after receiving, their own money, or that it will be harder for them to manage their families. When marginalized groups are empowered, be they women or youth, how do people really respond? I mean, what did you see happen?
I think that's when you have to watch the film to watch it, see what happens. I can just say it was a very big source of anxiety for the men in the village. And I think something that also kind of the women were talking about in amongst themselves of like, what are we going to do with this newfound independence or newfound kind of sense of empowerment? And so I think that it is something that we follow in the film. And frankly, I think the jury's still out. The experiment is continuing for another 6 years. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see the lasting impact on relationships overall.
Now, tell me a little bit about Larry Madowo, who's in the documentary. I mean, because he was one of my favorite things about watching it. How did he get involved?
Larry came about because of Soko. He had worked with Soko a little bit on Soko's previous film. And so he had known about Larry. And so for listeners who don't know Larry Madowo, he is Kenyan himself, but he works internationally as a journalist. Currently, he's an international correspondent with CNN. And so he is a celebrity in Kenya. I've been around the streets of Nairobi with Larry, and just everyone stops him. And so he's a very big name there, a very trusted person and face. And so we went to Larry as someone who kind of has looked deeply and studied deeply the relationship of NGOs in a lot of different African contexts. And we just wanted to get his opinion. And Larry, voiced some skepticism and decided that he wanted to learn more, and essentially came along with us on this ride of watching this village grow and change, and also really kind of putting a magnifying glass up to Give Directly as an organization and how they were working within the village as the American outsiders coming in. And he gives a very great and well needed perspective to the film.
Something that really struck me while watching your film is that it seems, at least to me, to be pretty even-handed. I mean, it shows both the good and the bad, the upsides and the downsides of something like UBI, particularly in this African context. Was this a conscious decision at the start, in effect, to not take a side in this debate?
Yeah, I think that we, ultimately we see a UBI as a pretty positive thing overall. We see positive impacts to the village, I would say. We really wanted to tell a story that was from the recipient's perspective. And so I think that there's a lot of stories out there where, at least in my world, where kind of the organization comes in and we see all the benefits they bring to a place that is poor and a poor population, and we kind of all just like celebrate and then walk away. And that isn't the case in this film. And I think we get to see more in depth what it is really like from a person on the other side who is receiving something like a UBI in this sense, and how it really impacts their lives in a deeper, more authentic way. And so that was really our goal in making this film, was to provide sort of that window and that I think that experience overall.
You alluded to this earlier, but this idea that there's a lot of people, especially in developed countries, who are very much against the idea of UBI and think that either it will never work or it will cause people to stop working entirely. And then during COVID, we experienced what was probably the biggest ever experiment in UBI, with many countries in effect paying their citizens regardless of whether they were working or not. So these massive cash transfers to provide that kind of social safety net that helped, obviously, to reduce the stress and the anxiety that populations felt, to keep them safe, to keep them at home, to keep them able to function. Have you therefore seen a difference in how people talk about UBI and their reactions to your film after COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it was a real turning point for us in making the film. I think, as I was saying before, it really did seem kind of like this niche conversation that suddenly blew up with COVID, and suddenly everyone can understand in this way that they previously couldn't, right? It kind of seemed as though we were having a conversation about poor Africans that didn't apply to them. And then suddenly everyone in the US needed some form of stimulus and protection, and everyone in Europe needed that. And it just became obviously a global phenomenon. And so I think it really kind of was this very unique event where people got to put themselves in someone else's shoes and kind of see it in a new light. And yeah, I think that it has really changed the conversation, and I think the possibility of a UBI being embraced in a bigger way.
Now, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but was there anything else that ended up surprising you or challenging your preconceptions as you made this film?
Yeah, well, as I said, there was a lot for me to learn about NGOs in Africa. And so a lot of that really did surprise and challenge me in terms of the story we were telling. But then I also think in terms of the UBI itself, going through the experience of the pandemic with the village was very interesting. Just seeing, I think, on a base level in terms of the effectiveness of a UBI, we finally would, after lockdown and this and that, we were finally able to get back to the village to continue filming as the pandemic wore on. And the level of security that the people had in the village versus their neighbors was very apparent. People were honestly continuing to thrive, I would say. One of our main characters was able to buy some cows and extend her farm. And, people were continuing to just kind of live their lives and go on, whereas their neighbors were just really in a bad place with a lot of anxiety and a lot of very real hard problems to deal with on a daily basis, where literally eating every day is a challenge. And so I think to see the effectiveness of cash and of a UBI in that context was really surprising and kind of just an amazing window into something that we got to experience.
Is it fair to say, in your opinion, that the concept of universal basic income has proven itself, but that the devil is in the details, and that what we need to ensure is that the implementation takes into account the specific local context, the specific, local needs, that, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution?
Yeah, exactly. I think that was our biggest takeaway from making this film. If we are going to embrace the UBI, which does seem like a positive piece of the puzzle, right? I don't think it is the silver bullet to solving poverty, but I think it's certainly one effective measure that should be embraced more and more if we're going to continue to live in a capitalistic society, which it seems like we're all on track to do. I think then it really comes down to who's implementing the UBI and what can a program like that look like. And yeah, it does seem to be kind of by a case by case, country by country basis.
Finally, what's next? The experiment is supposed to go on for a total of 12 years, and your film only covers the first 5. So are you planning to continue telling this story?
Yes, we are. We see free money as a piece of a larger project, and I have to say, we're continuing to figure out exactly what the bigger piece of it all really is, but we may have a follow-up film or some other kind of series that looks at different facets of UBI and that hopefully continues to track what's happening in Kogutu. I think the really interesting thing will be, yes, this experiment is 12 years, but what does this village look like in 14 years, right, after Give Directly has left? And we can really see the effects, for better or for worse, of what this money has done. And so, yes, we are hoping to continue on, and that this is kind of just the first part.
Lauren, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And I know that we could definitely keep this conversation going for much longer. There's so much to cover. It's because it's a really great story. So if our audience want to watch Free Money, where can they do so?
Sure. So we are still continuing to figure out its distribution worldwide. If you're on the continent of Africa, it is available on Netflix now to stream. In the UK, it's available to buy or for rent on Amazon or iTunes. And we're continuing to figure out the distribution for the rest of Europe and the US and the rest of the world, essentially. So just beginning to roll it out now, but hopefully more to come soon.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So for our listeners, that was Lauren DeFilippo, documentary filmmaker and partner at Insignia Films in New York City, and co-director, along with Sam Soko, of Free Money, which I can highly recommend. So please, if you're listening to us, go and check it out. I assure you that you're going to enjoy it. But for now, that's goodbye from Geneva, and I hope you'll join us again for the next episode of the Future of Work podcast.